Owen Taylor had never intended to draw attention. For most of his adult life, he moved through cities like a shadow, present, observant, but never disruptive. His work as a landscape ecologist kept him tethered to nature in ways that few around him ever understood or cared to. He dealt not in broad theories or desk-bound designs, but in soil types, microclimates, and root systems. To him, land wasn't just property, it was a language, and every patch had its own dialect. When his colleague from the Municipal Development Office forwarded him a listing for a small parcel of land just beyond the town's eastern boundary, Owen saw more than a dusty, overgrown lot. He saw potential. Not the kind developers salivate over. There were no plans for a strip mall or a luxury duplex here. No, this was personal. A rare stretch of undeveloped soil, bordering a sleepy cluster of older homes with neat hedges and American flags nailed into porch columns. No sidewalks, no corner stores, just a looped cul-de-sac with a controlling residents association and an unhealthy obsession with order. He purchased the parcel outright, modestly priced due to its ambiguous zoning history and the fact that no one had built on it for decades. The lot sat adjacent to what the locals referred to as a quiet community, which in Owen's growing experience usually meant a place where anyone different was swiftly asked to explain themselves. But Owen didn't plan to live there permanently. He had submitted paperwork with the city to start an urban ecology pilot, a study of soil rehabilitation and microbiodiversity in suburban dead zones. The study wouldn't involve construction or machinery. Just him, a tent, a notebook, a laptop, and a few environmental sensors. 2 weeks of observation, solitude, and quiet work. The kind of thing no one would notice, assuming they weren't looking for something to be upset about. He arrived with little fanfare. A battered hybrid SUV with no bumper stickers, a neutral green tent with no flashy branding, and a collapsible camp table. He set up near the edge of the tree line, deliberately avoiding the more visible areas near the road. His tent sat far enough from the neighboring houses that he couldn't even hear conversation from their yards. On the first evening, he walked the perimeter of the property, made notes on tree species and soil composition, then cooked a simple meal on a portable stove. The sky was cloudless. Night came softly. For the first time in months, he felt his brain quiet. This was what he needed. But peace is a fragile thing in places where people feel entitled to control what they see. It began with glances. Subtle, but sharp. As he sat at his table cataloging samples on his second morning, a woman walking her dog paused on the other side of the property's loosely defined boundary. She stared at Owen for a moment, then continued walking without a word. Later that afternoon, as he was adjusting the angle of a soil sensor, a man in his 60s with a golf polo and mirrored sunglasses pulled his car halfway up the gravel shoulder, stepped out and snapped 2 photos with his phone before silently driving away. Owen tried to brush it off. Curiosity was normal, but the next morning, he woke to find a plastic sign zip-tied to a tree near his tent that read, "Unauthorized use of private land, subject to penalty." No name, no ordinance code, no legal markings. Just bold red letters on white plastic. Owen calmly removed it and tucked it in with his gear. He documented it, just in case, but made no complaint. Not yet. On the 4th day, around 7:30 a.m., as Owen was boiling water for coffee, 2 police cruisers rolled slowly down the road and stopped at the edge of the property. A woman emerged from the passenger side of the lead car, gesturing energetically toward Owen's camp. She wore pastel-colored activewear, a tight expression, and a visor. It didn't take a genius to guess who had called. One officer approached Owen calmly, hand resting near his belt but not in a threatening manner. The other stayed back, clearly watching the woman more than anything else. "Morning," the officer said. "We received a call about a potential trespassing situation." Owen stood slowly, not startled, but mildly irritated. "I own this lot," he replied evenly. "I have the deed in my car if you'd like to see it." The officer nodded. "That'd be great, just for the record." His tone was routine. No accusation, just paperwork. As Owen retrieved the folder from his dashboard, he could hear the woman's voice behind the cruiser. She wasn't shouting, but every word was sharp and theatrical. "We don't know who he is. He's been out here for days. No one in the neighborhood approved this. There are children here." He handed the officer the documents. The officer flipped through them, nodding to himself. "This checks out. You're within your rights. We'll just log the report as a resolved non-issue." "I'd appreciate that," Owen said. "And for the record, I'm conducting an approved study. The city knows I'm here." "Understood," the officer replied. "We'll make a note of it." The cruisers pulled away 5 minutes later. Owen didn't watch them go. Instead, he returned to his camp stove and poured his coffee with steady hands. But something inside him had shifted. The woman, whoever she was, hadn't asked him anything directly. She hadn't approached. She'd gone straight to the nuclear option, uniformed authority. She hadn't been concerned about legality. She had been insulted by the visual of him. A tent, a stove, a man alone in a space she believed should be empty. By noon, she had introduced herself. "Karen," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "I'm the board lead for the neighborhood. Just wanted to say hello. It's important we all get along." Owen thanked her curtly but didn't invite her to sit. She remained standing on the outer edge of the property, pretending not to scrutinize every detail of his setup. "We like to keep the area cohesive," she continued, "uniform. It helps maintain home values, you know." Owen nodded non-committally. "I'm sure you won't be here long," she added after a pause. "I'll be here as long as my permit allows," he said, "which I assure you is well within legal parameters." Karen's smile flickered. "Of course, just so long as it doesn't become permanent." He didn't respond. That night his gear was left untouched, but the trailhead he had cleared on the first day had been deliberately blocked with brush and rocks. No footprints, no obvious signs of who did it, but the message was clear. There would be no dramatic confrontations, no fists thrown or fires set. Just quiet sabotage, the kind that came from people who knew how to manipulate systems and social pressure without ever looking directly guilty. And Owen understood then. This wasn't about his tent. It was about control. A patch of green in a rigid grid. An outsider, not homeless, not helpless, but independent. That made him dangerous. Not for what he did, but for what he represented. And if this was how they wanted to play it, he would respond. Not emotionally, not impulsively, but surgically. By the book. Because the one thing more threatening than a rebel in a tent is a man with legal footing and time to stand still. It began with the soil. Or, more precisely, what had been done to it. Owen first noticed something was wrong when he returned from a brief trip to town, just a few hours away to pick up supplies and meet with a colleague from the university who had offered to lend him a high-resolution pH meter. When he returned to his site, the first thing he noticed was the smell. Faint, but distinctly off. The earth near his tent gave off a chemical tang, bitter and sour, with undertones of something synthetic. It was the kind of smell that didn't belong in untouched land. He crouched near the center of his test plot and ran a gloved hand through the soil. The texture had changed. It was tackier, almost clumping unnaturally. His sensors, though primitive, told the rest of the story. The salinity had spiked, the moisture retention had plummeted, and several of his seedlings, part of a controlled rewilding experiment, had begun to wilt. It was subtle, but deliberate. He didn't panic, he didn't scream, he documented. Photos, sample bags, notes. everything logged with timestamps. Then he carefully pulled up the damaged samples, set them aside for lab testing, and began a perimeter sweep of his parcel. That's when he found them. Small, muddy tire tracks, narrow like those of a riding mower or utility vehicle, leading in from the gravel access path and disappearing behind the tree line. It hadn't rained in 2 days, so the ground was dry enough to preserve the indentations. Someone had entered his property, and whoever it was, they weren't just curious. They had brought something with them, something destructive. Later that evening, he received a call from the city's environmental services clerk. Apparently, a local resident had filed a complaint alleging that unauthorized chemicals were being used on suburban land adjacent to a residential community. The phrasing was generic, almost bureaucratic in its opacity, but the message was clear. Someone was trying to paint him as a threat to the neighborhood's health and safety. Owen politely explained the situation, offered to send copies of his permits and lab protocols, and scheduled a site review with the city for the following Monday. The clerk sounded unconcerned. "Happens more often than you'd think," she said. "These neighborhood groups like to feel involved." But Karen wasn't trying to be involved. She was trying to control the narrative. And this was her opening move. The next morning, Owen discovered a large, laminated notice pinned to a post just beyond the edge of his lot, placed where anyone driving by would see it. Neighborhood Safety Advisory. Potential hazardous use of land under investigation. Report all activity to community lead. No logos, no city seal, just official enough language and a phone number with a familiar area code, Karen's. Owen didn't tear it down. He left it there, documenting it with the rest. She wanted to provoke him into a scene, a reaction she could use against him. He wouldn't give her that. Not yet. What he did instead was escalate. Not with confrontation, but with process. He contacted the Municipal Records Department and requested all zoning overlays for his parcel and the adjacent tracts. He requested a certified land boundary review and submitted a request to the tax assessor to verify the classification status of his land relative to the adjacent properties. The data took time to arrive, but when it did, it confirmed what he already suspected. Karen's so-called community authority held no jurisdiction over his lot. His land had been classified as transitional municipal property, a designation that had been grandfathered in from the county's original planning maps and never revised due to the absence of permanent structures. In plain terms, that meant the local neighborhood board had no claim, no voting rights, and no enforcement power over it. But that truth didn't deter Karen. It just made her bolder. That weekend, Owen awoke to find the access road to his property partially blocked. A row of orange plastic safety cones, flanked by bright yellow construction tape, stretched across the gravel path. A handwritten sign on a nearby tree read, "Temporary closure. Utility maintenance in progress. No permit numbers." No visible workers. Just cones, tape, and obstruction. Again, he documented. Again, he did not remove them himself. He contacted the city's non-emergency service line, filed an obstruction report, and requested official verification that no public utility work had been scheduled for that location. The confirmation came back within the hour. No maintenance had been scheduled, and no authorization had been granted. The cones and tape were promptly removed by a city inspector, who also took photographs and filed an incident report. That afternoon, Owen received his first anonymous letter. No return address, no signature. Just a folded piece of printer paper sealed in a plain envelope, slid into the Ziploc pouch where he stored weather reports. "You don't belong here. This isn't your kind of place. Leave before someone gets hurt." The handwriting was unnaturally neat, blocky, and rehearsed, almost as if someone had traced it. He held it for a moment, staring at the paper, then folded it again and placed it into his evidence file. He wasn't scared. He was irritated, and he knew, without proof, but with certainty, that this wouldn't be the last one. The next municipal workday, Owen visited the zoning office in person. He met with a land use supervisor, a woman named Adrienne, who, upon seeing his thick binder of documents and photos, narrowed her eyes and said, "Tell me everything." For the next 45 minutes, Owen laid out the timeline, the escalation, the behavior of the local board, and his growing concern that an informal system of harassment was being used to push him off legally owned property. Adrienne didn't interrupt. She asked precise questions, took notes, and eventually nodded once, sharply. "They've done this before," she said. "Not exactly like this. But the board here, especially your Karen, they like to play fast and loose with zoning influence. You're not the first complaint I've seen." Adrienne explained that the city had limited bandwidth, but there were pathways. If Owen was willing to submit a formal claim of interference with land use, it would trigger an internal review of the neighborhood board's practices. It wouldn't happen overnight, but it would open doors. Owen agreed. The paperwork was dense, but he was methodical. He signed every page, cross-referenced every timestamp, and handed Adrienne a full-printed dossier of everything that had happened since he pitched the tent. She smiled faintly as she took the file. "You're more prepared than most attorneys I've met." That night, Owen returned to his site to find that his trail cams, installed discreetly on the first day to track wildlife patterns, had been moved. Not smashed, not stolen, just shifted slightly. The angle was wrong, the height changed, the memory card missing. Subtle, controlled, a message. He checked the others. 2 more had been tampered with in the same way. Someone had come into his space and made sure he knew it. They hadn't erased everything, just enough to unsettle. He sat for a long time in his camp chair, not moving, not reacting, just breathing. He knew that the line had been crossed now, not legally, but psychologically. This wasn't just sabotage, it was territorial, predatory. Someone believed they were hunting him out, and they expected him to run. But Owen wasn't moving. Not yet, and certainly not on their terms. The shift was unmistakable. If the prior incidents had felt like passive resistance, a blend of suburban passive aggression and procedural obstruction, what followed next was unmistakably strategic, organized, and laced with menace. Owen wasn't surprised by it, not anymore, but what unnerved him was how methodically the pressure increased. It wasn't just Karen anymore. She had allies now, or at the very least, people willing to follow her cues. The attacks, once silent and isolated, began happening in coordinated waves, always just subtle enough to avoid immediate legal consequence, but persistent enough to remind him he was being watched, studied, and pushed. It started one morning when Owen stepped out of his tent and found the front entrance to the parcel lined with sharpened garden stakes, hammered unevenly into the dirt like some grotesque picket line. Dozens of them, spaced tightly and topped with reflective tape, forming a jagged barrier just wide enough for a man to squeeze through, but not a vehicle. There was no accompanying note, no claim of ownership or signage, just a message sent through material. You may be here, but don't think for a second that you belong. He took photos, of course, every angle, every footprint. He sent the images to Adrienne at the zoning department, who responded within the hour with a short but telling message. "This is accelerating. I'm looping in enforcement." But enforcement took time, and Owen was still very much on his own. The city could act eventually, but neighborhoods moved faster. That same afternoon, as he walked the southern edge of the property taking soil samples, a drone passed overhead. It was small, civilian-grade, with blinking lights and a camera rig. It hovered low enough to clearly focus on his tent, then circled twice and buzzed away toward the cluster of houses behind the tree line. When Within hours, clips began surfacing on local Facebook groups. Grainy, low-resolution video footage of Owen's setup, framed with ominous captions like, "Is this legal?" and "camping or squatting," and "no accountability from the city." He'd expected surveillance. He hadn't expected smear campaigns. What struck him most, however, was the framing. Not the literal video framing, but the rhetorical one. No one posted, "Who is this man?" or "What is his work?" They had already decided. The narrative was fixed. He was the intruder, the threat, the disruption. The drone reappeared the next day. This time, Owen was ready. He filmed it from the moment it entered airspace and submitted the footage along with a formal nuisance report to the city. He didn't try to knock it down. He knew better than to escalate physically, but he did trace its flight path visually and noted the approximate takeoff direction. The information was incomplete, but enough to suggest it launched from within a block of Karen's home. No proof, not yet, but the pattern was undeniable. A few days later, the harassment took on a distinctly cruel edge. Owen returned from an off-site consultation to find his portable toilet, rented legally, placed far from the nearest home and serviced weekly, had been toppled. The base was cracked, the contents spilled. Nearby, in a patch of dirt where he'd begun cultivating native grasses, someone had driven a garden spade into the ground with force. The handle had been snapped clean off and left protruding like a grave marker. It was a desecration, plain and simple, and again, no witnesses, no claims, just mess and threat. This time, Owen didn't call the city. He called his lawyer. He hadn't intended to retain legal representation. At the start, he'd assumed permits and patience would be enough. But now, with tangible damage and a clear pattern of aggression, he needed more than documentation. His lawyer, a property rights specialist named Layla Byrne, listened without interrupting as he laid out the last 2 weeks in detail. When he finished, she simply asked, "Has anyone used the term constructive eviction around you yet?" Owen shook his head. Layla explained. Constructive eviction was a legal theory wherein a property owner, though not formally removed, is harassed or pressured to the point of being effectively pushed out. It was rarely easy to prove, but in cases like this, where an informal body exerted pressure under false pretenses, it could be a viable countermeasure. Layla began gathering affidavits. They needed statements from neighbors, confirmations from city departments, timestamps from drone footage and public posts. Owen provided everything he had. In the meantime, she drafted a cease and desist letter, not just for Karen, but for the entirety of the Neighborhood Association's board. It wasn't an accusation, it was a warning shot. Any further attempts to interfere with Owen's lawful use of his land would be interpreted as hostile intent. The letter had an immediate effect, though not the one either of them hoped for. The following morning, Owen discovered a folded flyer wedged under the windshield wipers of every vehicle on the street, including his. The flyer bore the board's official letterhead and claimed that a third-party landholder was threatening legal action against the neighborhood and placing an unfair burden on families seeking to preserve the community's character. It wasn't a direct attack, but it was a masterstroke of indirect deflection. Suddenly, the harassment wasn't about Owen being alone in a tent. It was about him weaponizing the legal system against ordinary people. The implication was surgical. He wasn't the victim anymore. He was the aggressor. And worse, the flyer was signed by the entire board, Karen's name printed first, followed by 4 others, none of whom Owen had ever seen or spoken to. Layla's response was swift. She filed a public notice with the city clerk refuting the board's claims and clarifying the legal basis of the complaint. She also requested a hearing with the city's Land Use Commission, a bureaucratic body that typically dealt with zoning disputes and code violations, but which had the power to investigate systematic harassment if it affected public interest. "You And then, almost predictably, the vandalism stopped. No more signs, no more drones, no more broken tools or sprayed chemicals. For 3 days, Owen's camp was silent. He knew better than to trust it. Silence in this context was never peace. It was strategy. And he was right. On the 4th morning, he found a new sign. Not from Karen or the board, but from the city. An orange placard, affixed to a stake at the center of his lot, marked, "Pending Review. No construction or development permitted until case resolution." It was technically valid, part of the procedural review, but its placement and timing were suspect. It was visible from the road, bold and public. It created the illusion of wrongdoing, even though Owen's use of the land hadn't changed. When he called Adrienne, she was apologetic but firm. "It's standard once a review's filed," she said. "I didn't know the sign would go up before our office contacted you. I'll flag it, but I can't remove it without protocol." He understood. She was doing what she could, but the process had inertia now. The review would proceed, but the neighborhood had already seized on the optics. Later that day, he saw Karen again. She wasn't alone. She stood at the edge of his parcel with another man, older, dressed in khakis and a utility vest. The two of them didn't speak. They just stood there, hands in pockets, watching. She nodded once, almost smugly, and turned away. The man followed. Owen didn't pursue. He simply made a note, snapped a photo, and returned to work. Because in war, not all battles are loud. Some are quiet, slow, strategic, and this one was only beginning. The call came unexpectedly early, 6:38 a.m., a number Owen didn't recognize, cutting through the morning stillness before he'd had time to start his usual circuit of soil checks. He answered out of instinct more than curiosity, expecting a wrong number or a city clerk confirming a permit detail. Instead, a clipped female voice introduced herself, Naomi Patel, Assistant Counsel for the Municipal Land Use Commission. She informed him, in the same matter-of-fact tone someone might use to explain water shutoff times, that the commission had decided to grant a preliminary review hearing regarding the actions of the neighborhood board in relation to his property. The hearing would be held in 10 days. She didn't ask questions. She simply stated facts, confirmed his address, and ended the call with, "You'll receive formal notice by mail, but I recommend preparing now. Bring documentation, dates, photographs, anything that shows a pattern. The board will be notified as well." Owen stood there for a moment after the call ended, his phone still pressed to his ear, feeling the faint tremor of an adrenaline spike. It wasn't victory, not even close, but it was leverage. A public hearing meant public record, and public record meant eyes, accountability, pressure. This was no longer just his quiet war in the trees. The battlefield was shifting. By the time the formal letter arrived 2 days later, Karen had already responded. Not officially. She didn't file any counter-motion, didn't request a delay or clarification, but she made her position known in a way that was unmistakably hers. Owen returned to his camp that afternoon to find a tidy arrangement of items placed squarely at the center of the access path leading into his property. There was a cardboard box filled with faux community pamphlets, concerned citizens of Maple Loop, printed in heavy type, though no such group legally existed. Alongside it sat a copy of his permit application, badly photocopied, annotated with red marker. No structural integrity review. No impact survey. Questionable intent. Taped to the outside of the box was a single sheet of paper, folded once, addressed, "To whom it may concern." The letter read like a manifesto, detailing the degradation of neighborhood values, the erosion of social cohesion, and the unchecked experimentation threatening their way of life. It wasn't signed, but at the bottom was a typed phrase, "We speak as one." He didn't laugh. He didn't react. He photographed everything, boxed it back up, and handed it off to Layla, who received it with a knowing shake of her head. "They're trying to anchor a moral narrative before the hearing," she said. "They want to muddy the waters, turn this from a property dispute into a cultural one. Oh, if you're the outsider, the disruptor, they can justify any resistance as preservation." Layla's preparation for the hearing was methodical. She broke down their approach into 5 pillars: legal ownership, land classification, documented interference, procedural overreach by the board, and reputational harm. The last one was the most delicate. It would require not just demonstrating that the neighborhood board had acted beyond their authority, but that they had intentionally sought to damage Owen's credibility and disrupt his lawful use of the land. The social media posts, the signs, the letters, all would need to be introduced as evidence not of simple disagreement, but of calculated defamation. They had one unexpected breakthrough. A whistleblower, a former member of the board, who had resigned quietly months earlier after clashing with Karen over procedural integrity, reached out through a third party. She agreed to submit a written statement describing Karen's aggressive tactics, how meetings were run more like coronations than discussions, how dissent was discouraged, how neighborhood protocols were often invented or retroactively justified. She stopped short of providing full documentation, but her statement was enough to provide context, to show that Owen's case wasn't an anomaly, but part of a pattern. The days leading up to the hearing passed in a strange kind of quiet. There were no new acts of vandalism, no drones, no anonymous notes. Karen disappeared from view almost entirely, her car unseen, her house curtains drawn. It didn't feel like retreat. It felt like calculation, as if she were saving her ammunition for a more public stage. Owen used the time to his advantage, reorganizing his documentation, streamlining his charts, triple-checking every timestamp and photo. When the day arrived, the hearing was held in a modest municipal building, the kind with cracked linoleum floors and flickering fluorescent lights. The room was less full than he expected. Only a handful of attendees, a 3-person panel from the commission, Layla at his side, and at the far end, Karen seated rigidly behind a small folding table, flanked by 2 board members and a lawyer who looked like he'd been pulled from a country club luncheon. The opening hour was procedural: introductions, scope, legal framework. Then came Owen's presentation. He didn't speak much. Layla handled the narration while he provided clarification when asked. The evidence was clear, well-ordered, irrefutable. The panel listened without interruption, occasionally leaning forward to study a particular image or email printout. There was no drama, no outbursts, just a steady unfurling of months of harassment wrapped in the polite language of neighborhood standards. Karen's response was tepid at best. Her lawyer tried to question the classification of Owen's land, implying ambiguity, but the commission shut it down quickly. Municipal records had already confirmed his status. When asked directly whether the board had issued warnings or orders without authority, Karen claimed they were merely advisories. When shown the signs and public flyers, she hesitated, then deflected. Community members often act independently. We can't police every lawn sign. The tone of the room shifted visibly. But it was the final exchange that changed everything. A commissioner asked Karen a direct question. "Were you aware that the board's governance authority does not extend to parcels outside the established residential tract?" Karen paused. Her lawyer leaned toward her, whispered something. "I was aware that it was unusual," she said finally, "but we believed it was in the best interest of the community to engage proactively." There it was, not a denial, not even an excuse, just a thinly veiled confession of motive, control, not compliance. The hearing concluded without a decision. Those would come in writing. But Owen left with a certainty that hadn't existed before. The commission had seen through the charade. Karen's veneer had cracked, and though the final verdict was still pending, the tide had turned. The war wasn't over, but the battlefield was his now. The silence following the hearing was not relief. It was recoil. Owen had sensed it before, the way an animal crouches low not in surrender but in preparation. There was no sign from Karen. No letters, no damage to his equipment, no further procedural noise from the city. But the quiet wasn't natural. It was too still, too managed. Something had shifted beneath the surface. Layla, who had seen too many legal dust-ups slide into personal vendettas, warned him not to interpret the lack of noise as absence. "She's calculating," she said. "You cut off her influence over your property in public. That won't be forgotten." It began again with a misdelivered notice, a citation from the city's sanitation department left hanging from the edge of his fence. The infraction cited unauthorized dumping of organic refuse visible from a public right-of-way, a phrase so vague it could apply to any leaf pile in a gust of wind. Owen knew immediately that it wasn't real. The city didn't issue notices without prior inspection, and he kept his land clear with almost obsessive regularity. But there it was, printed on city-style cardstock, laminated, even barcoded. When Layla checked with the department, they confirmed no such citation had been filed or printed. It was the first forged document, but not the last. Within a week, Owen received 3 more. A notice claiming imminent pest inspection due to a community complaint about rodents, a second referencing soil contamination, and a third, most absurd of all, suggesting that he had missed a scheduled property appraisal connected to a tax reassessment initiative. None were filed in the city system. Each was crafted with precision, just enough official language to be confusing, just enough familiarity to cause doubt. For every fake, Owen requested a verification. The time and energy wasted were not incidental. They were the point. Karen wasn't acting through public channels anymore. She was eroding him through bureaucracy's shadow. The fear of missing a deadline, the dread of unseen hearings, the mental weight of constantly wondering which envelope would be real. Layla labeled it for what it was: administrative harassment. "It's a form of psychological warfare," she said. "Keep the target off balance long enough and eventually they either overreact or leave." Owen did neither. He installed a second locked Dropbox for incoming mail and requested that all formal notices from the city be sent digitally through encrypted email. He began storing physical copies of every envelope received, regardless of content, in a dated logbook. But even as he fortified his systems, the attacks changed shape. The next phase was communal, where before Karen had acted through signs and anonymous letters, now she began to marshal sentiment. He noticed the shift on a Saturday morning while shopping in town. 2 cashiers at the grocery store who had always been polite turned distant. One glanced at him, whispered something to her coworker, and abruptly left the checkout line. When he returned to his vehicle, a sticky note was attached to the rear window. "Destroying a neighborhood isn't science." He recognized the phrasing. It was a bastardization of something Karen had said during the hearing, her concern that unregulated scientific experimentation erodes trust in neighborhoods. She hadn't invented it for that moment. She'd been rehearsing it, polishing it for wider use. Now she was seeding it through conversation, packaging the conflict in moral terms. Owen wasn't a researcher anymore. He was an intruder, a threat to cohesion, a symbol of everything that unsettled the delicate social compact of places like this. One night, well after dark, he was awakened by a metallic clatter outside his tent. Not the mechanical hum of a car, not footsteps, but the deliberate rattle of metal striking metal. He stepped outside with a flashlight and found a collection of tools strewn along the path. A rake, a spade, a pair of gardening shears, all broken or rusted, arranged in a chaotic pile. It wasn't vandalism, it was message writing, and the message was clear. Your work is nothing. Your tools are trash. Your presence unwelcome. He photographed it, removed the items with gloves, and added them to his file. Layla escalated in kind. She filed a complaint of coordinated harassment with the county-level commission overseeing special land designations. The complaint included fake notices, vandalism, photographs, timelines, and even handwriting comparisons where applicable. The commission replied 3 days later, notifying both parties that an administrative investigation had been opened to determine whether the neighborhood board had engaged in systematic intimidation or abuse of non-resident property holders. It was a bureaucratic knife to the gut. Slow, precise, and with wide potential fallout. That was when the board turned on itself. The fallout began as whispers. A longtime treasurer resigned suddenly and without explanation. Another member reportedly stopped attending board meetings. Karen's once unified voting bloc fractured. There were murmurs that she had acted without proper consultation, that some board members hadn't known the full extent of her campaign against Owen, and, more dangerously, that she had used discretionary funds, those raised by resident dues, for purposes not outlined in board bylaws. The details were thin at first, but enough leaked through local rumor networks to gain traction. The final straw came from within the neighborhood itself. A longtime resident named Samuel Breck, a man in his 70s with no prior interest in politics or drama, sent a formal statement to the commission outlining his observations over the past 3 months. In calm, unemotional language, he described late-night meetings in Karen's garage, the distribution of flyers, the surveillance drone launched from a cul-de-sac driveway, and, most damning of all, a comment Karen made during a block party. He'll leave. They always do. It's just about who breaks first. Samuel's statement wasn't just hearsay. He included photos. One showed Karen with a set of documents she described as neighborhood justifications, none of which had ever appeared on public agendas. The commission requested a full audit of the neighborhood board's governance history, including financial records, procedural votes, meeting minutes, and resident complaints. Karen went silent. The rest of the board scrambled. Owen stayed still. He maintained his schedule, continued his field work, and allowed the storm to move around him. But even as the administrative wheels turned, Karen made one final move. A desperate, clumsy, unmistakable lunge. On a windy afternoon, Owen returned from collecting air samples off-site to find the edge of his property, specifically the boundary closest to Karen's home, smeared with red paint. Not spray paint, but brush strokes, deliberate and wide, tracing a crude line that bled onto rocks and tree trunks. At the base of a tree, a sign had been hammered in. Community jurisdiction begins here. It was hand-painted, shaky, but the meaning was clear. She had tried logic, bureaucracy, optics, whispers, and silence. Now she was trying symbolism. Territory, claimed not by law, but by audacity. Owen didn't touch it. He took photographs from every angle, measured the line's path, then emailed everything to the commission and Layla. Within 24 hours, 2 inspectors from the county arrived on site. They removed the sign themselves. The next day, a notice was posted publicly. The neighborhood board was suspended pending full investigation, and all decisions issued under its name were to be considered void unless reviewed and reapproved by interim city oversight. It didn't make headlines. There were no news trucks, no social media uproar. But inside the neighborhood, it landed like a siren. Residents received letters informing them that until a new board was formed under direct supervision, they could not enforce any collective rules, could not collect dues, could not impose fees or penalties. Every prior ruling now stood in legal limbo, including those involving home modifications, landscaping fines, and neighbor disputes. In effect, Karen had not only lost control, she had broken the machine she once ruled. The governance structure she'd used to wage her war had been decommissioned. She had no more tools. And for the first time since Owen arrived, her house sat dark for 3 consecutive nights. No porch lights, no movement, blinds pulled tight. Owen didn't celebrate. There was no triumph in dismantling dysfunction, only exhaustion. But the ground beneath his feet, scarred, studied, and finally left to heal, had never felt more stable. Karen's absence was not the kind of retreat that suggested surrender. It was the stillness of something coiled, uncertain whether to strike again or slink away entirely. For several days, the neighborhood was saturated with a kind of eerie normalcy, a forced quiet that felt more like a community holding its breath than one returning to peace. The board had been suspended. City oversight had replaced any semblance of local governance, and residents were suddenly faced with the realization that the very structure they had entrusted with decisions over their homes, their fences, their front lawns had not just overstepped, it had collapsed. And in the center of it all stood Owen, the man who had, without raising his voice or stepping onto a single porch, changed everything. He felt it in glances, in the way people paused when walking by the edge of his property, in how cars slowed just a little longer at the corner. Not everyone was hostile anymore. Some were quietly curious, others visibly embarrassed, but the scrutiny hadn't faded. It had just changed shape. Owen maintained his routines. He submitted his final ecology report to the city's sustainability department, detailing every stage of soil restoration, plant introduction, and human interference. He dismantled his field equipment slowly, methodically. The tent came down last, not because he feared another attack, but because it had become a marker, a strange little monument to the fight that had never really been about camping or land use, but about control, perception, and boundaries, both legal and psychological. It might have ended there. It could have. But a week after the final oversight letter was mailed to residents, a process server knocked on Owen's temporary field office door and handed him a thick envelope. Karen had filed a civil suit. It wasn't just against Owen. It was against the city, the commission, Layla, and 2 members of the suspended board who had publicly distanced themselves from her. The claim? That a coordinated conspiracy had been enacted to damage her reputation, destabilize the community, and undermine her authority without cause. In the narrative she submitted, Karen painted herself as the protector, a woman who had tried to guard her neighborhood against unregulated intrusion, only to be sabotaged by institutional overreach and betrayal from within. The language was florid, almost operatic. She spoke of cultural decay, of anarchic influences, of social engineering under the guise of scientific legitimacy. She was, in every sentence, the martyr. The city's legal team quickly filed a motion to dismiss, citing lack of merit, and Layla prepared her own response. But the lawsuit itself, its very existence, sent a ripple back through the community. Some residents, unsure of where to align, began quietly asking questions. Could she win? Would the oversight be reversed? Could her case bring consequences for them as well? The fear returned, not of Owen, but of instability, of continued exposure, of their names being dragged into hearings or subpoenas. Karen knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't trying to win the lawsuit. She was using it as a pressure tactic, a last gambit to force doubt into the minds of her former allies and to fracture the fragile calm that had followed her political downfall. Owen felt the tension sharpen again, cars idling longer near his entrance, small groups forming on sidewalks, the low thrum of anxiety returning to a neighborhood that had barely begun to breathe freely. Layla was unfazed. "It's textbook," she said. "A scorched earth strategy. She can't win control back, so she'll burn the reputation of everyone who didn't side with her. But she's bluffing." Still, Owen took precautions. He installed additional security cameras, retained a part-time assistant to manage document intake and legal correspondence, and kept his schedule deliberately predictable. Visible, transparent, unthreatening. The tent, now stored, was replaced with a small prefab structure, permitted and approved, containing nothing but field notebooks, soil samples, and a kettle. He invited 2 representatives from the city's environmental office to walk the property with him, showing them each area of restoration, every native plant, every improved soil cell. They left visibly impressed. One of them even remarked that the plot could be a candidate for a state-level sustainability grant. It was the first time anyone had spoken about the land in terms of potential rather than dispute. Then came the letter. It arrived not through lawyers or clerks, but slipped under the door of his field station during the night. A single page. Handwritten. Careful, cursive. Karen's. There was no greeting, no direct apology, no acknowledgement of the chaos or legal war. It simply read, "You've won something. I hope you understand what that cost all of us." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even defiance. It was something more bitter, more difficult to categorize. A final refusal to admit wrongdoing paired with the admission that the fight had changed her, and not in ways she could undo. Owen read it twice, then burned it in the metal firepan beside his workstation. Days later, the court dismissed the lawsuit. Lack of evidence, failure to establish harm, procedural overreach. The judge's opinion was concise. This case lacks substantive merit and appears intended to intimidate through litigation rather than seek resolution. Karen didn't appeal. She vanished from public view entirely. Her house, once a symbol of managed perfection, grew still. For sale signs appeared not just in front of her home, but 2 others, neighbors who'd once backed her fervently, now looking for a quieter street, a fresh start. The city announced a temporary freeze on any new neighborhood board formations pending audit results. In the meantime, residents were advised to manage disputes through standard municipal channels. Some grumbled. Others expressed relief. A few began holding informal gatherings to discuss whether they wanted any new governance at all. For the first time, they were having the kind of conversations Karen had always prevented. Messy, uncertain, but open. As for Owen, he didn't claim victory. There were no press releases, no public statements. He finished his report, submitted applications for new soil rehabilitation grants, and began planning a small communal green space on the south end of the parcel. A few residents, cautiously at first, expressed interest. One asked if they could help plant. Another donated a bench. Small gestures, but genuine. The land had never been the real battleground. It was just the stage on which entitlement and fear tried to write permanence into something that was never meant to be static. And in the end, what stood wasn't a courtroom win or a committee vote, but the quiet emergence of space, protected, scarred, but finally allowed to grow. Summer edged toward fall, and the land began to settle. The once disputed parcel that had been host to confrontation, surveillance, sabotage, and litigation now hummed with quieter energies. The grasses had taken root. The trees, spared further vandalism, stood unmarred. The soil, once poisoned and disturbed, showed strong signs of biological recovery in the last round of testing. But the most remarkable transformation was not ecological, it was human. Without a board dictating appearances or enforcing conformity, the residents of the neighborhood were slowly and awkwardly beginning to recalibrate. They were no longer subjects of a managed illusion. They were neighbors again, and some, perhaps for the first time, realized how little they had actually spoken to one another under Karen's long shadow. Owen kept to his habits, but he no longer felt observed. The tension that had lived in his shoulders for months, taut and familiar, had loosened. He still documented everything, force of habit now, but the entries were routine, technical, grounded in science, not defense. One morning he arrived at his station to find a small gift left at the door. A bag of seed packets, native wildflowers labeled with handwritten notes on bloom times. No name, no signature. Just a quiet offering. A week later, someone left a thermos of coffee. Then, one of the newer residents, a woman named Linda, stopped by and asked if Owen might be willing to advise on her own soil issues. Her backyard had always struggled with drainage, and now she figured, why not ask the one person who had stood his? Ground against the whole system? The gestures were small, but significant. He helped Linda, offered suggestions, drew her a water flow diagram. Then he was asked to speak, informally without fanfare, at a local school's environmental science club. Word of his project had traveled further than he expected. There was something grounding in that shift, in being seen not as an intruder or a warning, but as a resource, a contributor. Not everyone embraced it, of course. Some neighbors avoided eye contact, and a few still treated the land as a sore spot. But the resistance was quiet now. Unfueled and without leadership, it couldn't organize into anything more than individual discomfort. Karen never returned to the public eye. Her house was eventually listed for sale by a third-party agency, her name absent from all promotional materials. Rumors persisted that she had moved out of state, possibly closer to extended family. No one seemed to know for certain, and even fewer seemed eager to find out. The house remained empty for weeks, the lawn untended, the blinds closed. Then, one afternoon, a crew arrived to clear it out. Boxes loaded silently into trucks, garden tools bundled and carted away. No final message, no curtain call, just exit. With the oversight board still in place, the city began issuing small policy recommendations for neighborhoods like this one. Suggestions aimed at preventing unchecked local governance from creating future hostilities. Among them, mandatory election transparency, accessible complaint channels, and a prohibition against informal enforcement without documentation. They were quiet reforms, administrative at best, but Owen understood their weight. They were safeguards, not for him, but for those who might come after. In late September, Owen stood beneath the large oak at the edge of his lot and watched as the community garden's first bench was installed. It wasn't elaborate, a simple wooden structure anchored in stone, but it was the first physical structure on the land not meant for defense, for surveillance, or for warning. It was just a bench, a place to sit, a signal that whatever had happened here was over, and something else was allowed to begin. He didn't own the neighborhood. He didn't want to, but he'd claimed his space, and in doing so, he had opened one of the most rigidly defended gates in suburban life, not by breaking it, but by standing still long enough for it to fail on its own. As he sat there for the first time, alone, with the late sun slanting through the trees and the soil beneath him no longer contested, Owen felt the rarest sensation of all. Not vindication, not victory, but peace. Earned, kept, and, finally, shared.